and hopefully you have already gotten an introduction to open educational resources during this session, during the COLTT conference so far. I know that there have been sessions on OER and promotion opportunities. You've probably learned about assignments, textbooks, and some information from some of the early adopters, and I am one of those. Now, this workshop is going to be about how to use OER successfully. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey from first hearing about it, second, trying it, third, implementing it, and fourth, writing about it. And now I'm sharing it with you. I do want to point out that this was not an individual process. In fact, nothing about teaching is really. So today we have 4 presenters. We have Susan from the library. We have Angie from the Faculty Resource Center. We have a student, Dan, and myself. So you'll get a professor's perspective. And I also want to thank the Colorado Department of Higher Education for providing the grant for this work. Angie and Dan, take it away.
All right, well, we do want this to be an interactive experience for you, so we're not going to waste any time in that. So to begin, I want you to think a little bit about your OER experience, what you know about it, what you've heard about it, and then use just one word to describe that or capture that in the chat so that we can get a little bit of an idea of where you're coming from when it comes to open educational resources.
Overwhelming, yeah. Awesome, I like that. Any others? Natasha, yes, that's exactly what I found. Needed, definitely. Okay, so while you're continuing to type there, we're going to go ahead with the overview. So, whoops, I can't flip. There we go. Angie,
yeah, sure. Absolutely. So as I mentioned, we do want this to be interactive and so that you can experience firsthand what we are kind of talking about and demonstrating today. So we're going to talk a little bit about ourselves, give you a little bit of background about that, introduce you to the takeaways and things that you can do to be successful in OER. Definitely define this OER process a little bit more, especially through what is called the OER Success Model, and then kind of wrap it up. And so hopefully as you go through the session, you'll be able to get some tips and tricks and some good strategies so that you can successfully implement OER in your course, in a department, or even as a part of a program. And on that note, we did list a session note taker as a part of this session. So if you have that, you would want to access it now. You can type it, print it, or whatever to just jot down some ideas, some notes that you may have along the way. So I'll go ahead and introduce myself first. My name is Angie Dotson. I am an instructional designer for the Faculty Resource Center at UCCS. I am also part of the UCCS OER Council as an instructional designer for the Open CU initiative at UCCS. Most of my educational experience has been as a secondary social sciences teacher. I taught grades 7 through 12 throughout the 16 years that I was in the actual classroom. From there, I transitioned to corporate instructional design and content development, and that is what has landed me here at UCCS.
And we're very glad to have you.
Thank you.
So my path was a little different. I served 20 years, 1 month and 1 day in the Air Force, not that I was counting. But it was wonderful, and I got to teach 8 of those years at the Air Force Academy. So I decided I loved teaching, so I ended up at UCCS in a role here. I am also the UCCS Teaching Fellow Lead, so I work with the Faculty Resource Center to provide inputs to other faculty on how to improve teaching, teaching tips, and doing conferences like this. Today, we're going to talk about my journey with OER, but we're also going to tell you how you can succeed in OER. But most importantly, how we can use OER to benefit students, because that's why we're really all here, to benefit the students. So with that, I will let Susan and Dan introduce themselves.
So yeah, hi, I'm Susan Vandergriff. I'm UCCS's Scholarly Communications Librarian. I am currently the chair of the UCCS OER Council, and part of what got me into OER in the first place is that I have a background in textbook publishing.
I guess I'm next. I'm kind of flipping between different screens here, trying to get the word cloud generated. So I'm Daniel, the guy with the voice who's way deeper than it should be. I'm a graduate student in mechanical engineering at UCCS, studying thermofluid sciences and astrodynamics, so a bunch of high-level physics stuff. More relevant to why I'm here, though, is because I helped Dr. George with her writing of her OER textbook for astrodynamics. I also TA'd her astro course the first time this last spring when she did a full OER. I'm also a TA for a space environments course over the summer, and I have a little over 2 years experience working at the Mass Center as well. So that's me, that's all of us. And next, I think, is the word cloud, but I'm not quite finished building it yet. So
okay, we'll give you a few more minutes.
Yeah.
I was going to go into the workshop objectives, which is first, what is OER and why should you care about it? Second, how to find OER and ensure it's of good quality, because like some of you observed in the chat there, sometimes OER is just not available for a particular topic, and that was the major thing that I ran into. And then third, how to use OER to improve your course and student learning. Angie?
All right, so as a part of my role in the OpenCU initiative, we in the FRC have put together an OER Success Model that basically outlines steps, and I actually have developed a program of courses that flows along this model where people can be successful in their implementation of OER. And so that starts with S in success, which is to start with the 5 W's of OER. Now, you may be familiar with the 5 R's of W, but we focus first on the 5 W's, which includes what OER are, ways they're used, why they're important to higher ed, who benefits from them, and where you can find those things. And then that moves into how to use OER repositories to find that OER that you are wanting to use to enhance your course experience. Then it moves into how to choose relevant OER, and this ties into making sure that OER is utilized and chosen in a way that fits for you. So if you're someone who is looking to replace a textbook, that's an option for you. If you're looking to fill in gaps, that's an option for you, that kind of thing. Next is the way that you can customize OER to, again, fit for your course, your students, and even your teaching style. The next part is to educate others about OER, and then to survey student performance or impact that OER has on your students as you implement it. And then finally, to seek assistance and to share out your experiences, which is what we are doing a little bit today. So we'll first begin with the 5 W's and what are OER. So many of you may have a preconceived idea that it's all about open textbooks, but OER is much more than that. They are free resources, and that could include, of course, textbooks, but it could be articles, it could be courses, it can be course components like learning activities or case studies, it can be just little lessons, it can be something as simple as a video, it can be images, and it even can expand out to more open application, open source applications or software, and even tools that can be used, or even open pedagogy. And so OER is generally designated by its license or the way that it can be used. And you can go ahead and, yep, there you go. So OER is generally licensed according to Creative Commons licenses. And these licenses allow or designate how the OER is used. And this is where the 5 R's of OER come in. So OER can be retained, it can be reused, it may be able to be revised, remixed, and or redistributed. And so each of these licenses designate how that OER is going to be used. It is, if you look at that first one there, the attribution, that is probably the most open way that you can utilize OER. So if you see that license with the CC BY, that means you just have to acknowledge where you got that and that it was licensed this way. And then the restrictions of the licenses move up to be most restrictive. The one on the end there where it says CC BY NCND is the most restrictive. And so you have to show attribution, give credit for that particular OER. You cannot use it commercially, nor can you make any derivatives of it. And so that's mainly where you would just retain it and reuse it at that point. And so the licenses can be kind of complicated depending on how you're using them, but they do give you a very big characteristic and designation that is OER, and then gives you insight into how specifically you can use that OER. So then the third one, we'll go into the third W. Lynanne's going to share a little bit more about that one.
Okay, so to access the third of the 5 W's of OER, why is OER important? First, I'd like to talk a little bit about what you perceive as the pros and cons. So I ask you at the beginning to put in one word. Now's your opportunity. You can say more than one word. So what do you have as far as the pros and cons? So I'll list a few that you already have up there. Challenging. Hopefully my ink's coming across. Could be challenging for accessibility and visually impaired. Innovative, that would be a plus. I think someone mentioned before free. Can adapt or adaptability. And flexible. Sustainability and support for revisions. Yeah, that is a big one. And one thing I wanted to add there. Sorry, I'm in Georgia right now, so we have lots of bugs. One thing I wanted to add is that it can be time consuming, even if the material's already there. That's what I found. Writing your own material can be time consuming, so you cannot be a perfectionist. That's why Nicole's point here, you can involve students in creation, is very important. You, like I said before, you can't do it on your own, and students like to get involved in having some input in what not only they're learning, but also to help out future students who will be taking your course. So great. It's good to see that we have more pluses than minuses, but I think there are a few things we're going to keep talking about that will make it more apparent. So with that, Dan, are you ready to share the word cloud?
Yep, I'm good to go now.
Okay.
So I will go ahead and get that running. All right, so this is the word cloud from all the stuff that I was able to pick out of the chat. So some of the words aren't quite exactly what you guys put because I need to shorten them, make them fit nicely in a cloud. So yeah, I mean, how do we want to talk about this? Because we have challenging, that's definitely a case. I've learned that working with Dr. George. Free as a student, that's a big thing for me, obviously. Transformational, I think, is also important because it is very transformational, it's very different. You also have a needed, which I very much agree with as a student. I think the classical resources have some issues that OER can fix. Easy to use is kind of a yes and no thing, depends how you do it. So that's an interesting point. And then I love this one, educational democratization. Looks like something you put in a political slogan. As for access, so we had two people talk about access. So OER does have the benefit of potentially, you can do it right, it's easy to access, but you also have some other issues. So I know we had someone talk about its accessibility is difficult for those who are visually impaired. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. Engaging, definitely like Dr. George just talked about. You can get the students involved in creating it to make it far more engaging. And then overwhelming, again, Dr. George also talked about that. Writing your own textbook, it can be very overwhelming, and just doing this search in general to try and see what's out there and figure out what you need to develop is also pretty overwhelming. Difficult, same kind of things that go in with overwhelming. And then lastly, just because the word cloud put it there, awesome. Yeah, very awesome.
I like that last one. So go ahead and stop sharing and I'll share my screen again. And Dan, you're up again.
Yeah, already. So I'm kind of different in this group because I'm a student. I've also TA'd for a couple of classes as well. So as a student, there are a couple of things that OER can be really good for and will do a better job of teaching. So the one thing I've noticed as a student and being a TA for other students is that availability and accessibility of resources is probably the most important thing out there. So one of the issues is, of course, textbook prices. They're really expensive. You know, as an engineering student, that bookshelf you see behind me, that small kind of beigey one that you can't really see the bottom part of, is the third most expensive thing that I own. First most being my apartment, second most being my car. So yeah, engineering textbooks are not the cheapest in the world, and that's definitely a big setback. But there are also other costs as well. So what I've called general accessibility costs. So again, in engineering, and I no doubt other fields are the same, you have other sort of additional resources or packages that come with your textbooks. So like for us in engineering, it's typically software packages, but there's also other stuff there as well. And that can be kind of a pain to deal with. Now at UCCS, we have a really awesome IT team who handles most of that for us. But undoubtedly, there's always something that slips through. So in our case, in the mechanical engineering department, that slip through case is what's called a program called SolidWorks, which is a computer assisted design / modeling thing. And I'm sure every other field has their own software package that's like this, where it's like, okay, I want to do a thing, in this case, design something 3D printed or whatever. I go to do that. I load up SolidWorks and it says, oh, licensing error. Great. So now I don't get to do the thing I want to do. Now I have to send a bunch of emails, submit a bunch of tickets to get the licensing thing sorted out. So now a week after I've done that, now I can finally do the thing I wanted to do. That, of course, is a big problem. You don't want to have, as a student, you don't want to be dealing with that stuff. You just want to do what you want are trying to do. So that, amongst the other things, is a big sort of additional cost. And then last point there, as a student, I think the move to online has largely made a lot of these problems worse. So that's kind of the limitations with what we're going to call classical resources. So paying for a textbook, paying for all the licensing and stuff. So how can OER fix that? Well, one of the things obviously is a free textbook. We're not having to buy a textbook. That's a big one from a financial standpoint. But even aside from that, it's not just making the education cheaper, it's also making it better, at least in my objective opinion. So the big sort of issue there is OER can facilitate more focused or organic teaching. So when you're trying to make a class, you go looking for a textbook. Well, every field is going to have their big, Swiss Army knife, multi-purpose, does everything textbook. But they're like 1,000 pages long with a price tag to match. I got like 3 of them on my bookshelf. They're all over $200. So that's not great. The other option is you go for a more focused textbook, but inevitably, no matter how many textbooks you search through, none of them is going to have exactly everything you want with nothing else. So they're going to be cheaper, but they're holes. And you have to find some way to fill those holes to work around the textbook, and that's not great. So OER is great because it allows the teacher or professor to specifically design the material right directly precisely for what they want to teach and not have anything else in it. So that makes the content far more engaging just because it's entirely what you need and not anything you don't need. You're not being distracted by anything else. You're not having to sift through a bunch of other stuff just to find what you're looking for. So in that sense, OER is great because A, don't have to pay for a textbook, but B, the content's also more focused to what you want. And then last one I want to talk about are some potential pitfalls. So the current OER landscape is pretty sparse. There's not a lot out there, as Dr. George found doing stuff for astrodynamics. That problem, though, is one that will pretty much solve itself. It's straightforward to solve, but not easy to solve. It's going to take time and a bunch of people working on it, but that problem kind of has a solution already, just by people expanding the use of OER. The other one is that classical resources have one distinct advantage in that they are central. So everything's all nice and compact in one thing. It may not be very good, it may have some issues, but it's all in one place. So as teachers, as you guys go to design OER, you want to make sure you're centralizing everything and not having to route students over here, then over there, then over there. Because then you get to the availability, accessibility issue, which is, in my opinion, is the most important one out there. All right, so that's my perspective on OER and why it can be great. And I'm going to hand it off to Angie for why OER might be for you.
Right, exactly. And so to me, this is really the precursor to the next two steps into the model, and that's in using, choosing, and then customizing your OER. So you want to have a starting point. And the best starting point is, why is OER for me? So if you have high enrollment classes, if you have a lot of high first gen students, then you want to consider using OER because of the cost and the access to your resources. If you're looking to update your material, keep it current, maybe offer some alternative sources of information to your course, then those are some reasons to really focus on utilizing OER and customizing that OER. Dan kind of mentioned some of the gaps that may exist in your current content, and the fact that when you do use a textbook that it becomes outdated very quickly. Like I've heard that as soon as it goes off the press, it tends to be outdated. And so a way to fill in those gaps, to update and keep that content current, OER is a good alternative for that process. The other thing is to consider, how accessible, how inclusive, how diverse is your course and the course content. And so if you're wanting to expand in those areas, finding those alternative sources, looking for different ideas and perspectives about your subject matter using OER, and even finding ways to engage students are very good, solid reasons. And so if you're really focused on finding OER and utilizing it in a way that's going to enhance your course, you really want to start with why it is for you, and then start your search strategies based on that premise, which will lead us to our next phase of the model, using OER repositories. And Susan, you'll take.
Yeah. So first, to just go over some basic search tips for looking for OER. So I'm the librarian, and this is really a lot of what I do to help with OER on our campus. Librarians are very good at finding things. We don't know everything, but we know where to look. So some general search tips is, first, just start broad. As we've mentioned a couple of times now, there are some things where there aren't really necessary materials, but the best bet you have for finding things in your field is going to be to start as broadly as possible. Next, most repositories that you're going to look in are going to have filters. Those can be really helpful for you in terms of narrowing down what types of materials you want, what licenses you're willing to consider, and what level of education you're looking for. You do want to be sure that you check those licenses, make sure that you can use the content the way that you want to. And then finally, as we've mentioned a couple of times, not every subject has open educational resources, but there's other ways to look for other openly licensed material, as Angie mentioned, to kind of fill in gaps in your curriculum with no extra cost to students. So I'm going to go ahead and actually demonstrate searching just a little bit. So share my screen. So what we're looking at now is the OER Commons. This is one of the main repositories that I end up sending faculty to. And we're on the browse page right now. So you can actually get kind of a sense for about how many items there are in different fields. And I will say the distribution is not even. Some fields definitely have more open educational resources than other. And down here under material types, you can see, as Angie mentioned earlier, OER come in all different shapes and sizes, right? They come in all different forms. We have everything from textbooks to activities to games, all kinds of things. So when searching, just like I said, I tend to start as broadly as possible. So if I was looking for an OChem book, I would start by just searching for that basic premise. And then I can start to look through what's available. And again, as I mentioned, lots of really good filters in a lot of these different repositories that would allow me to decide what I needed to do with it and filter by that, as well as, thinking about what is it that I actually want. So if I want a textbook, I can filter for that as well. More broadly, you can actually search for openly licensed materials just in the web in general. For Google, you do this by going to Settings. And I'm going to move the little zoom thing over here. Go to your advanced search. And down here, you actually have this usage rights filter that you can use to align to those different Creative Commons licenses. And so I could do a search for chemistry materials this way as well. In terms of how I help faculty with this, we do have an open educational resources LibGuide at UCCS. Lots of libraries will, so I would definitely check your own institutions. We also have a list of some other OER LibGuides around the country. And here we just kind of have a list of all of these different places for finding open resources, open textbooks, and things like that. And I'm going to pop the link to this in the chat. And you are going to get a chance to practice searching a little bit on your own.
And also, if you did happen to download and access the resource guide for searching for OER for higher ed, that provides a lot of links as well. I'll go ahead and share what that looks like. That's part of what I've put together to help faculty in that pursuit. So it looks like that. And so I've kind of divided all the resources into where you would find whole collections. You can search by subject. If you're looking for a particular ebook, not just in e-text, but also different kinds of ebooks. E-learning sources. Crash Course is a really good one, especially for videos. And it's a very fun and exciting way to either introduce a topic, review a topic, or just explain a topic. They're really fast paced and a lot of fun. I've done it through other video resources, specifically open text. So this is a really good resource to utilize as well. All right, so to begin your search, you can determine the type of OER you would like to locate using any of those kinds of resources that we showed you. And then if you're having trouble, you can always go to a more advanced search or filter method for finding that. We'll just give you a couple minutes just to come up with a couple of things maybe that you could potentially use as a part of your course.
And I will say you don't have to use these today. If you don't find something you want during this session, feel free to just find something that looks interesting to you or that you might like to explore further.
And I would recommend not trying to look for astrodynamics resources because you're not going to find a whole lot.
Although if you do go looking for software packages, you might find one that's actually semi-good.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's listed anywhere on OER sources. So.
You mean SDK?
No, GMAT.
Oh, GMAT.
Do we want to say how long we're giving people to work on this?
Just a couple of minutes. Maybe till about 3 or 4 minutes. Let's say 4 after. And I guess we could ask while we're searching, while you guys are searching, if you have anything and can find something, go ahead and let us know. We'd love for you to share with us.
Hi there. My
Yeah.
name's Erin. Here,
Hi,
I'll
Erin.
turn on my screen. Hi, I have a quick question. As I'm searching on the OER site, I was just looking up things for digital storytelling. And under some of the resources, something pops up that says some rights reserved. And then it says the copyright holder has received some rights, but has not applied a Creative Commons license or an educational use rights statement. Please check the original use permission the author or sources has provided. What does that actually mean? And does that mean as well, like, what does it mean as well as, like, should I even be looking at that resource at all?
Yeah. Hey, Erin. This is Susan. So yeah, that it usually means there's they've provided it freely, but they're not actually guaranteeing you all of the rights that are normally associated with an OER, which the librarian term for this is called bronze open access, right? It's something that's freely available, but is probably still under copyright. In terms of how you could use that in your class, you could certainly direct students to it, but you're not allowed to make copies of it. So like you couldn't print it out and distribute it to your students. That's not technically permitted. You wouldn't be allowed to copy all of the text or something from that, reuse it in a new way. You would really just be allowed to point people to it, kind of the same way you could with anything that's under copyright that's available online. You can point people to it because they've made it freely available, but you can't necessarily reproduce that in any way or really alter that. So you could use it, but it's going to be a little bit trickier than some of those more traditional OER that have a lot more freedom to reuse and remix.
Thank you. That's real clear. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
Not under those circumstances, I've also seen faculty just write for permission. We've had a couple of developers who are writing their OER. Maybe it's a really old textbook that they're not publishing anymore, so they have pursued rights for certain parts of that text to include as a part of OER. So that's always an option as well.
Anyone else have a question or like to share what you're finding? You're probably saying it's not 4 after yet. Okay, now it's 4 after. So anyone find anything of interest you'd like to share? Or are you probably thinking, I need a lot more time than this, right? In which case I completely understand. So we will move on. And Angie, this one's yours.
Yeah, so after you have gotten started, are a little bit more familiar with what OER is and how you can use it, and you've located some, then it's time to choose relevant OER. And as a part of the OER Success Model, it's important to take a course inventory. So you want to pinpoint areas of your course that's most conducive for OER based on your teaching style, the course content itself, and then the student needs. And of course, student needs technically are the driving force for most of all of this. And so that's a very important thing to assess as you're looking to choose a relevant OER. So you want to be keeping in mind the accessibility, the content, the complexity of the reading levels, those kinds of things. And so another part of this is kind of drawing out or planning how you're going to integrate OER. So you want to develop a plan for either course implementation. Maybe you're a department head who wants to see all of your faculty utilizing OER in some way, so you can kind of map that out. Or maybe you're working on developing an online program where OER would be a really big beneficial aspect or component of that program. And so then think about the reasons why, the rationale for the OER choice, and see where OER can be used as a gap filler in any of those areas, whether it's the course as a whole, in the courses that your department offers, or even in the program itself. OER is a tremendous way to fill gaps that exist in any of those particular areas. And then the potential, think about the potential student impact. How is this going to benefit the kinds of students that I normally have in my particular course, or who make up a part of the college or in the major that my course is associated with? So these are things to keep in mind as you're picking and choosing your OER.
Susan?
Yes. So when thinking about choosing your OER, you want to make sure that you're also evaluating it. And so there's lots of different OER rubrics in the world. I think we've actually provided you with one as a part of the session, and there's lots of things to consider. So we've already mentioned how important licensing is, thinking about what can you actually do with this, and is it going to be flexible enough for what you need to accomplish in this class? Recency, how up to date is this information? Quality, is this good information? You know, applying your subject expertise in your class to make sure that this is good content for you. The format, so this is thinking even as simply as something like a PDF. Will you be able to change it if you need to? Will you be able to change it into other formats for accessibility purposes, things like that? Accessibility itself, is this going to be accessible to all of your students? And then finally, thinking about representation. You know, someone brought up knowledge democratization earlier. And yeah, OER presents this wonderful opportunity, not just for us to, you know, increase who all has access to textbooks, you know, not just based on wealth, right? But also who gets to write textbooks and who gets to contribute and create knowledge. And so you have an opportunity to think about how people are represented and who is included or excluded by this text. And with, you know, the ability to remix and revise OER, you can actually change and improve that OER to be more representative. So we're actually going to take a quick second here. If you did identify an OER in the last step, now's a great chance. We're not going to do a full evaluation, but just to see if you can identify the Creative Commons license or licensing information. So Aaron actually already did a great job of picking out the licensing information on a resource that they were considering. But if you can, see if you can find the licensing information for yours and put that into the chat. And if you're having trouble, let me know and I will get to you in the chat and help you figure it out.
So any questions or how does open access dovetail with OER, Nicole?
That's a great question, Nicole. So open access is in a similar way about knowledge democratization, right? It's about making sure that people have access to resources around the world, but also that people around the world are able to contribute to resources. So open access refers to really anything that is openly available, and there's different levels kind of associated with that. I mentioned bronze earlier. Bronze are things that are just free, but they don't necessarily have open licensing associated with them. More traditional forms of open access, gold open access, green open access, tend to again be published under a Creative Commons license or like new FDL license. There's some other licenses for things like software, but open access kind of refers more broadly to any kind of information that is being made openly available under a license that allows people to revise, redistribute, and things like that. Does that answer your question? And also a great thing about, especially if you're a researcher publishing open access, is that when you publish open access with those Creative Commons licenses, it means that your work can also be, your research can be reused in these ways. So journals that have articles under open access, yes. So most journals that have articles available open access, they are using some kind of Creative Commons license, which usually means those articles are themselves a type of educational resource so that you could actually incorporate those in to your OER as well. Yeah. Good question.
Thank you. So I wanted to go over quickly the example of the course material I put together for MAE 4410 Astrodynamics. That's a fancy way of saying space stuff. Textbooks, like Dan was mentioning, are outdated very quickly, especially in the area of space systems. They're very expensive, and there was no one comprehensive textbook that I found that covered everything. So requiring students to buy one book, much less 3 or 4, was not feasible. Current OER resources was very limited. So what kind of on my journey, what I did is in summer of 2019, I was introduced to OER by the Faculty Resource Center, and they said that grants were available even to instructors, which raised my attention because a lot of times instructors don't have a lot of access to getting grants. So that got my attention, and I realized there were a lot of drawbacks with the available text. And next in 2020, I implemented OER for the first time. So phase 1, I found some resources and links, many of which were self-developed because this is a course I'd been teaching for 20 plus years. So a lot of it was my own material. And then in 2021, I developed my own material. So the spring 2020 effort was mostly providing links and providing access. I would go through and make a list of resources for each lesson, provide that for the students. And the nice thing is, it wasn't all written. I could do videos, I could do interactive material and things like that. And then in this last year, when Dan was working with me, I created this Introduction to Orbital Mechanics textbook that I started writing on my own to incorporate some of those and putting everything together. And this is through Pressbooks, which was provided as part of the grant program. And that was a good tool to use. And here is some of the textbook. Notice that it has not only pictures, but it can also have embedded videos and things like that. And I also can incorporate, this is chapter 1, I also can incorporate little quizzes for understanding. So it can be made very interactive, unlike most textbooks. So for example, down here at the bottom, check your understanding. I could have a student what 2 laws were primarily used to develop the two-body equation of motion. Whoops, I need to go back and review that material. So that was very helpful. And also in chapter 2, for example, you can have interactive components like this simulation that is going to show you like how something gets in orbit. So students can play with this themselves and see that it takes some velocity to get into orbit around the Earth. So interactive components like that, it was a big plus. Also, I found that, like I said, I could not be a perfectionist with this. And so as I was writing it, I asked for students to help, and that was very important because students really like to tell you when you're wrong. I found they like to give you constructive feedback. So they were more than happy to do that, and I appreciated their inputs every step of the way. So with that, our next step is to educate others about OER. So Angie, I think that one's yours.
Right. And so a part of this process in the model is actually to be able to put some information together to share out with others, to educate others in the use of OER and how it can be helpful for them. And so utilizing the model to develop something like that, like we have done in the FRC, we have created an OER Success program, and I'll show you an example of that in just a second. Another aspect of education and getting OER implemented further is pursuing funds to help maybe give faculty stipends for those things, for the development of it, depending on what role you are and what a grant qualification might be, those kinds of things. And so what we've been able to do is, Lynanne already mentioned the Colorado Department of Higher Education. We've been involved as a part of the Open CU initiative in grant funds for the last 3 years. This is our 3rd year in that grant. So we are coming to a close in that funding. However, there are other options. I've pursued grants from the President's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, because after all, OER does open access to many students. It is more equitable as far as getting access and obtaining information, as well as you can customize it and make sure you're including diverse components within your course as a result. And so another area that I've been able to apply for some grant funding, or not really grant funding, but stipend funding, is through the Faculty Minority Affairs Committee on campus. And so we've been able to obtain some funds that we will pass along so faculty can develop and utilize the OER Success Model to implement and develop OER that works for their course. And so another aspect is the micro-credentialing, which you will see here as an example. So you're fine, you can continue. So this kind of highlights the OER Success Program at UCCS. It's divided into 3 parts and tied into the 5 Ws. So the OER Success Part 1 deals with those 5 Ws: finding OER, understanding why it's used, pinpointing that kind of stuff, doing a course inventory, and then putting that plan into place for how that OER is going to be implemented. And users will, or participants will earn a reuser badge, which represents both the retaining and the reuse of OER at that stage. The second is the OER Success Part 2, and this is where expanded use of OER begins. And so maybe that goes back to the why OER. So there's a focus on a deeper integration of OER and expansion of OER to make it even better for students. And at that point, people will be revising and remixing OER. And so that is why the remixer badge is earned for that course. And then the last phase is representative of what Lynanne just showed you, and that is the destination success, where a vision is constructed for what a ideal published OER might look like. It walks you through the publication process and then the sharing out so that others can do the same. So that's how we have used the model to educate others about OER.
Thank you, Shauna. So we will go on to what's next. First off, use your library resources. Susan is there ready and willing to help with anything that you need help on. She's already helped a few people in the chat here. So use your resources. Faculty Resource Center is there also, as well as get your students to help. Like I said, you know, Dan may not have had a great time doing it, but he was a big help and had some input into how the course will work for future students. Increase awareness and participation. So coming to sessions like this, you get some introduction to that, as well as presenting what you're doing and sharing it with others. I talk about OER all the time because I find that it's a great resource and something that not only can help you as faculty and your students, but also I've gotten some feedback from industry. I've gotten feedback from Lockheed Martin, Boeing, NASA. I just got an email the other day, someone in Thailand gave some kudos on one of my book chapters. So some great things can come out of it and expand those student roles. So with that, I wanted to say, in summary, OER can lower cost, increase student learning, and make use of your resources. Like I said, like Angie said, she's looking at some other funding for this. I'm sure you have some at your own university. So with that, I think we have 4:20. So that would be it for today. We'll be glad to hang around for a couple of minutes and see what questions you have. But other than that, thank you for coming today. And I wish you the best on your quest with OER. Thank you.